Assuming I post all of the videos as I intended to, this would be the final installment talking about Homo colossus getting to know our own subspecies better. And this one is going to be about how its members deal with the dawning recognition of the fragility and impermanence of the technosphere. And so I've already written and done videos about their state of denial, which I will flash up briefly and link below. So yeah, here are those posts about Homo colossus's state of misinformation and denial. And now this is how they kind of maybe move past denial, but don't get very far. And here are the videos about that, as well as one that I started to do about kind of what I'm expanding on today, which is how they're starting to face things and try to grapple with it, but again, not very successfully. Okay, so I will now read a quote by author and professor of Vanessa Machado de Oliveira. She also uses the last name Andriotti, and her book is Hospicing Modernity. And she writes, "We are living off expired or expiring stories. Stories that expire can no longer dance with you. They are lethargic or stuck. They can't move things in generative ways anymore, but we often feel we cannot let them go. Many of these expired stories give us a sense of security, purpose, and direction, precisely because they seem stable and solid. Thus, we become attached to them and get used to their weight in our lives. If we notice they are dying, we refuse to accept it, and we put them on life support." And so I guess one way that I see our culture embodying that is that even when they acknowledge that things are really, really bad, they will also say that, well, it could still not be bad though. But if you know that the technosphere is what's destroying the biosphere, and also that the technosphere is impermanent, I don't see how those things could be true, and yet also the future could be not ugly. Like, it seems like that's leading to a pretty dark place. Another place I see this is, for example, in the Guardian article that I'm about to read. The author writes at length about everything that seems like it is falling apart, and yet, rather than leaving it at that, they end on this note. They say, they quote someone else, Harfouche, who says, "This world we've created is ultimately a choice. It doesn't have to be like this." And then the author says, "We have the research technologies and wisdom to create better, more sustainable systems." And I think that again, confuses power with control. So first of all, just because you have the power to influence a situation doesn't mean you have control over the situation. Otherwise, we've known that things have been going wrong for a few decades at least now, and we would have done more about it if we'd actually been in control of each other and of the whole superorganism, this emergent effect that we are having on the planet. And then also, even our power and our power to influence is going to be declining as our access to fossil fuels declines, which it sounds like what she has in mind when this author says research technologies and wisdom to create better, more sustainable systems. I'm pretty sure what they have in mind has some engineering aspect to it that is going to be not in the budget based on the amount of energy and materials that we can access in the future. "It seems to me that we approach our culture's impermanence like we do abstinence-only sex education. We just insist, let's just not let it happen, instead of facing that what's underway is an inevitable natural process which would empower us with the language and skills, at least, to engage with it. And so, of course, because we don't talk about it and we don't have a way of even grappling with the idea of it, we find ourselves facing a polycrisis and only being able to access emotions like distress and frustration." And another thing about the way that we talk about all this is, like, when we acknowledge that things are currently bad, which the Sustainable Development Goals do, right? They say that there's a lot of room for improvement, but they also imply that we could reach this goal where everyone is living, all of the humans at least, and the members of civilized society, so to speak, are living a developed lifestyle, and that could be a state that could sustain itself, which is essentially implying that industrialism could enjoy immortality. So we have done away with old ideas of religion and afterlife, and now Energy Star certification is the new heavenly kingdom. And what's crazy is it isn't a secret that this isn't going well. Even the United Nations Development Program, in its own report, acknowledges that no country has achieved a very high Human Development Index value without contributing heavily to pressure driving dangerous planetary change. Our pursuit of development has neglected our embeddedness in nature, leading to new threats as a byproduct of development. New health threats, increased food insecurity, and more frequent disasters, among many others. And I will link to this report below. And here I wanted to tie this back to our fear of loss. Dugald Hine suggests in his book that our culture has a fear of death, and that drives us to do a lot of unwise things. But I would say that it's a fear of loss in general, whether that is like loss of material property or the endings of things that we enjoy. Like, it terrifies us even just for if the Super Bowl were to stop being a thing, like the way a lot of our favorite things ended temporarily during the COVID lockdowns, like that was really scary and disturbing to people. So yes, we don't like endings of any kind, even if it isn't death per se. It is just like we like everything. Once it comes into the picture, we want to preserve it in the picture. And if this fear of loss or death thing is of interest to you, two tangents that you might want to go down are looking up, first of all, Mort theory, M-O-R-T, and that's by Ajit Varkai. His last name is V-A-R-K-I. I don't agree with most of the theory itself, but I think that he makes some interesting, valid connections between the level of ambition, or another way to interpret it might be like mania, that empires or civilized societies exhibit when you're looking at like the projects that they engage in, these huge, like the technosphere and their pursuit of progress and what that looks like, and how they define it, and a fear of death and an inability, like a very extreme horror about it, and inability to deal healthily with that reality. And then the other thing to look into potentially if you're interested is Stephen Jenkinson. He's done some interesting podcast interviews and stuff about death. And so, things that I've heard him say that I found insightful was, first of all, that all the change that we're experiencing and how rapidly it's moving is really both relentless and purposeless. And like, how depressing is that? And then he also says that, if you look around to workers in a city, how they're rushing everywhere, why would anyone be rushing like that unless they are running from something? Like, obviously, not literally, but metaphorically, these things that we stay busy with in our careers are all just a distraction from the knowledge that we do eventually die. Life is finite, and our culture doesn't really set us up with a very fulfilling way to spend those finite life hours. And so just distract yourself as much as you can and pour yourself into your career success, even though in the end, you're just gonna, like, at this point, we're not gonna retire. And we definitely all do, just the only destination that we're all headed towards is death. So for my next observation about the way that we relate to the meta crisis, the poly crisis, I'm going to make an analogy to an individual who bothers to brush their teeth and eat healthy and exercise and get enough sleep. And when they're sick or injured, they take the steps that they need to recover. Now, I think if someone does that to simply improve their day-to-day experience of life, I think that is a wise and reasonable approach. But what we see now in society is that people are doing those things and like pursuing wellness routines because they want to live forever. And similarly, when we talk about society in general, or the civilization, and you hear from these people, like the kind of people that would speak at the World Economic Forum with their ideas of like what we can do to reduce the chance of civilization collapse. I mean, I feel like even IPCC experts at the UN talk about potentially preventing collapse. Is that they're mistaking the steps that you could take to soften the aging process of a society, which I think are wise and reasonable. And they misinterpret those steps as ones that could actually preserve civilization and prevent collapse, which is not accurate. And here is another quote about how people are talking about the polycrises, or specifically the climate crisis. And this is coming from Dugald Hine in Work in the Ruins. He says, "The way we talk about this trouble is making everything worse. The mobilization of fear and the language of emergency, the elevation of science into an article of faith and an overriding source of political authority, even when the intentions are good, even when the sense of urgency is sincere and well-founded. These moves push forward the project of making this living planet and its inhabitants into an object of technological management and control." He says that that's because the data can only describe, it cannot prescribe. Just like when, think of a patient's test results, ultimately it's the doctor's call on what to do. The scans don't tell you how to proceed. And now the what to do about it is being wrapped in data to make it seem like it's the one option or the obvious course, and it scares everyone else into desperately embracing whatever's being proposed instead of examining it. And so Hines says, "I reserve the right to be less scared than I'm told I should be, and less impressed by the latest declarations about what we know and what our governments have to do." So this next little bit comes from a fairly popular Substack post of mine, which I will link below, but it was, even my in-person friends told me that they appreciated it. And part of that was where I go through the reasons that this apocalypse is not like the previous ones, because right now I notice a lot of people being like, oh, well, humans have survived previous endings of worlds, and so therefore we have reason to believe that we'll make it through this one. And I don't know that that is logical. It doesn't stand up. So here are 4 reasons why. Number 1, the planet is in worse shape. Probably the region that you find yourself in is in worse shape than it was all those previous times that people survived. So the fact that they survived was based on the fact that wherever they ended up had the resources to support their survival. Whereas now we are just either deforesting, or the forests are being burned down and the soil is being depleted and all of the species are dying off and the food web is falling apart or whatever. So in general, the planet is a much less friendly place than it was before in those times when people managed to make it through. 2, we are different, or at least I am different. I am not cut from the same cloth as the people who made it through previous crises. I am not my great-grandparents who fled somewhere or whatever, nor am I an indigenous person who could just, be relocated and then somehow make do in that new location. 3, lots of people did die. So it's not oh, well, they made, when you say that other groups of people have made it through those hardships before, you're neglecting the percentage of them that were actually killed during the genocide, etc. And so therefore, in this case too, it is likely that although some lineages might persist past some point, and also what does it mean to make it through? But I think that a lot of lineages will also be ending at this point. They don't have any future generations to them. And then number 4, we're doing it. So especially if you're talking about indigenous people, surviving settler colonialism and preserving some of, obviously having descendants and preserving some of their culture, they weren't the cause of their own problem. It was an outside enemy, versus in this case, the cause of a lot of our problems is just some of the basic ways in which we are supporting ourselves to survive. So in previous videos, I've talked about the food system. So farming is causing a lot of what we are seeing, and it would take a lot you would either need to modify it heavily at the very least, or really probably fully just put a stop to it. And we're not going to do that. So this is less like some kind of outside enemy and more like a dog barking at its own farts. Anyway, I write a lot more eloquently about this in the post. So if you're interested or you weren't satisfied with the way that I just put everything, go check that out. Another way that people talk about the polycrisis is immediately framing it as an opportunity for something better. And like, why do we need to put this like sugar coating spin on everything? And even Dougal Hine notices in his book, he says that they tried to turn the COVID pandemic into a portal into a fairer world. But of course, now it's 2025, and is it? And I think what's behind some of this is like an eagerness to see things change quickly for the better, and they almost want the crises to be like a Noah's Ark type flood where like, great, everything's falling apart. And I think this is what's kind of behind accelerationism, right? It's just like, great, let it all fall apart. It'll wash away all the bad stuff, and then all that will remain is the good. And then we can continue on to live happily ever after. And it's like, well, are you sure that it would only wash away the bad stuff? Are you sure that any of the stuff, maybe some of the things that you like about your life, are also going to be like wiped out? And are you sure that you would have a spot on the ark as opposed to being one of the people who drowns? I also find it interesting how people will make references to fiction. And so like when I talk to people in their 20s about this, they will mention Hunger Games, and as opposed to like real examples. And I think that's so interesting how like those of us in the global north, or however you want to refer to it, like the closest, the most accessible example on the surface of our brains that is like available to us immediately when we envision dystopia or things falling apart is a major motion picture, as opposed to the real examples of people suffering in certain other countries under like very extreme conditions. And it's a shame that we aren't even more like, we know that that's happening. But it's almost like, it's not a matter of knowing that it's happening or not. It's like kind of like it's so unreal to us that Katniss Everdeen is more real and what she experiences versus like, why aren't we thinking of like an average little girl in Mozambique? And I also see a lot of talk about localization. It's kind of like permaculture adjacent. And like in some ways I'm definitely here for it. I think, as David Fleming says, it's the only way that is going to be available to us in the future. But I'm also reluctant to romanticize it, because we see that in certain places, when they are left to their own devices and cut off from the world, what you get is like, I mean, the Salem witch trials happened at the local scale. And, do you really want to be someone who is caught in the, also in the South in the future? And also because like we're definitely not more sane than we were in, when lynching was a thing. So who knows what could result from places becoming a little bit more isolated and insular. Next incoherent thought. Did you notice how during the Spain and Portugal blackouts, there were like multiple tales of the same event? And I realize that it's not necessarily practical for everyone to always acknowledge that there were multiple sides to a story, but it nevertheless was interesting to me that you had some certain people being like, oh, obviously grocery stores couldn't process transactions, and it was probably affecting like the medical industry and hospitals or whatever, right? But then you also had the people who had to put a positive spin on it and post the Instagram thing about like, oh, people were just like gathering in the plazas and dancing. And it just seems maybe a little bit privileged, because in other countries that experience regular power outages, it's not so easy. But then certain individuals within these European countries could just be like, oh, it was such a nice break to like be able to disconnect and unplug from my phone and like have a picnic. And it's like, yeah, I don't think you'd feel that way if it lasted like 3 days. So now looking at some headlines, what I mean to demonstrate with this one is that there is no point at which the government would necessarily admit or, be forced to admit that things are going downhill. It can get really bad, and the well, the government or the media could continue to spin a very different narrative. And so here we have Thailand, where the farmers are struggling to make ends meet, and yet it's also, the message is being promoted that this is a golden year for their industry. So this is an interesting situation, and the next point that I want to make is often when people refer to supply chain disruption and being cut off from fuel and forced to adapt, they will cite Cuba in the 1990s. And in fact, there's a documentary called The Power of Community, which you can look up on YouTube. But what I notice is that just because, if you were presented with predicament or problem A back in the past, and the people responded in a certain way, that doesn't mean that if you are presented with the same problem many decades later, that the people will again respond in the same way, because the problem might be similar: food shortages, fuel shortages, power outages, but the people are different. Or rather, the culture and the narrative that they believe in and their relationship to institutions and stuff is different than it was back in the day. And so we shouldn't necessarily expect to see the same response. It's very possible that they would respond differently, and that is true of people, say, in America. Just because people were pumped about Victory Gardens many decades ago doesn't mean that they would be pumped about Victory Gardens today. Even if the circumstances under which you're being asked to grow them are similar, the people are very different. So now these headlines and this podcast are related to what I said before, both about the need to put the positive spin on the Spain-Portugal power outage and the expectation that current disruptions will lead to something more beautiful that emerges from the ashes, just like Noah's Ark, and the fact that people that I spoke with who are younger immediately think of fiction stories before real life examples. So if you take all those together, I think that is reflected here. How this podcast assumes that, obviously once the current order is scrapped, that creates an opportunity for, local democratic power to take hold. And it's like, is that what we should be expecting? Or should we kind of maybe set our expectations a little bit lower and then be pleasantly surprised if that's what we get? Because when you do look at these examples from other places, you see that it is not all sunshine and rainbows. Another thing that I'd like to point out is that, there's this tendency to look toward indigenous voices for wisdom and inspiration. And I think it's worth saying that even within our culture, actually, the wisdom is there. I think that we just don't want to hear it. So, for example, in the English language, we have phrases like, "You can't have your cake and eat it too," or "You've made your bed, now you need to sleep in it." But I think that for some people, the ulterior motive of seeking the indigenous message is because they don't want to hear what I just said. They don't want to be told that. They want to hear something that is metaphorical enough that they can interpret it as they want to tell them what they want to hear, which isn't what I just said. Another weird thing, at New York City Climate Week, I guess last year, there was... The promotion of psychedelics was one of several features of Climate Week that diverged from the usual lineup of platitude-heavy panel talks. So, psychedelics. Also, other events included a series of climate-themed discussions and a performance by a drag wrestling collective in a pop-up boxing ring, as well as events filled with dancing, meditation, and imbibing cacao. Not that my take is necessarily the accurate one, but to me, it seems like that is... really, it's becoming about spectacle, which is fine. I think that's like a valid way of coping with this, or, if you want to distract yourself, fine, but let's just admit that that's what it is, right? Let's acknowledge the fact that Climate Week is no longer about pretending that we're going to be able to do something about this, and more just about catharsis and enjoying ourselves while we can. Which also reminds me of this movie called Aniara. I will link to a trailer of it below, but basically it's like everyone on this spaceship kind of like already knows that they are gonna die, and yet they aren't dead yet. And so it's kind of like, what do you do with the time in between while you are just dealing with the growing awareness? And people definitely do get a little bit wacky. And it does have me thinking about like, why is this so upsetting to us if we already knew, like, you figure out as a child that you're going to die. So like we all knew that we were going to die. And I think that part of it is knowing not only that the death is inevitable, but that it's probably, for people like me who are expecting it to be like a comfortable modern one, that's probably not going to be the nature of it. And just the fact that there not only is that coming down the line, but also that between now and then we're going to experience the like expiration of everything else that I enjoyed, and all of my dreams gradually being snuffed out. And maybe also part of what we're all experiencing, although for some people it might not be like at the top of their consciousnesses, is deep down we are aware that the universe is going to be demanding something fairly simple of us if we want to survive, which is to be just as competent as every single other one of the millions of organisms on this planet. And the reality is that most of us, or at least I can speak for myself, are not capable of just surviving without the like artificial support system of supply chains and institutions and whatnot. And so on top of all of the horror, there's also a little bit of humiliation, because isn't that embarrassing that I'm a creature that doesn't know how to creature on its own planet? Two thoughts before the sun sets. First, Overton window. It is very interesting to me the like where the line is on what is socially acceptable to say and not say and do and not do, and how that is changing, and in fact maybe changing pretty rapidly right now. So although not never fast enough. But anyway, first, the like narrowest standard for what is okay and acceptable and all right to talk about at happy hour is acknowledging that things are bad right now. I feel like it, like even if you are like a progressive movement, that's all based on a critique of the current order of things, but also the idea that it could be better, it could get better. Perfection is achievable somewhere out there on the horizon, and that is also at the heart of the Sustainable Development Goals. And so that's like the most conservative way of seeing the situation. And then if you stretch it open a little bit more, what's now becoming okay to like consider and acknowledge is the idea that not only are things bad right now, but they're also could get worse. And so I have some, not TikTok, but like social media screenshots to demonstrate that. So here we have Gen Z saying, oh, why am I supposed to be scared of World War III? Look at how much the world is already falling apart all around me. Like, that would just be more of the same. Or like, is that what they're saying with those? If you have a different interpretation, I've realized that may not be accurate or complete. Please enlighten me in the comments. Especially if you're Gen Z, what's it like? But yeah, and then the next level of like expanding what's possible to like publicly entertain is the idea that you would not only like talk a big game about how like, oh yeah, we're like totally headed into, Hunger Games or whatever, but to actually change your life and like to make a major move based on that expectation. Because then it's like, oh wow, like this is real, this is getting real. And so those are people right now who are relocating in response to the American political situation. So yeah, that's that. And then what I still see as being beyond those different levels of the window is an acknowledgement that like, well, the collapse that we're talking about is going to be complete, pretty like, thorough. And so while it'll move at different rates in different places, and there are better and worse places to be, it actually isn't going to be something that you can outrun or hide from or be exempt from. Like, it isn't like, oh, if you just make the right move, if you just move away from the places that are at risk for like climate, and if you just move, go to the climate haven and find the job that has that, that is more secure and all those kinds of things, then you can continue to have like this type of civilization-based lifestyle for yourself. And so if we were to ever, get into this level 4 of Overton window openness, what that would imply is that, for example, if I were at like happy hour with a bunch of normies, I could say something like, say something that alludes to the fact that there is going to come a day when we can no longer use flush toilets or have like running drinking water, or people don't have jobs. And people wouldn't, react as if that is completely preposterous, or that, I've been watching too many YouTube videos, I don't know if that day would ever come. But anyway, that's how I would map those. Like, maybe it looks like a target practice kind of thing, like these increasing rings of like what is possible to consider in public. And finally, what I wanted to share is this visual here. I think at this point, if you've listened to my channel or other collapse content, you aren't new to hearing about how much population has shut up. And so, this is nowhere near to scale, or nor does it show how dramatic the human population increase has been in recent centuries, or millennia as well. But what I mean to show here is that for the longest time, you had humans surviving for, hundreds of thousands of years in these lower oversight type methods, to use that phrase from my first video. So what I mean is hunting and foraging, and then also certain types of gardening and farming and animal husbandry, but nothing like the very intense methods that empires and civilizations, whatever you want to call them, implement, and that that they need to implement to be able to function as they do. And so, the scales that I have here are thousands of years and millions of humans. And at least according to me asking Google's AI, the number of people who are classified as hunter-gatherers prior to the emergence of civilizations and that totalitarian agriculture was somewhere between 1 and 7 million. And then at least if you ask Google today, there are still 10 million people living that way. And with civilizations, basically, we added eventually another 1,000 million humans, because of how that allowed humans to take control, particularly of calories. And then also with industrialism, again, between how that allowed us to extract more productivity from the land, and then also to have, modern medicine, we saw the human population rise to 8,200 millions, which, if it were presented to scale, would look like an even sharper rise. And so before I move to my camera, I just want you to take a look at the blue along the bottom and how that has been a constant this whole time. So now, to tie that back to the theme for this video of how members of civilization, Homo colossus, are speaking about the polycrisis, the trouble that we're in, I think we tend to present ourselves as potentially the ones who save the day and survive and make it through. And when I look at that population chart, it's very hard for me to see how in the near future there would be anywhere near as many humans, just based on what we know is going to go away. That being like primarily the things that led to those population boosts in the first place. So one was large-scale agriculture, which is now becoming more difficult as a result of climate. Could become, I don't want to like jump and be like, it'll become near impossible, but definitely much more prone to failure. And the other thing is the introduction of fossil fuels, which are a finite input, and our access to those is going to be declining. So those were like the two key things in ratcheting up the population. And so, to me, it seems that if they're going away, it would be very hard to keep our numbers anywhere near as high as they are. Continuing to think in terms of what is the story and what role do civilization members play in it, what I just said was that, okay, in the story that we're telling, we like to think that we say that everyone will make it through. And now, okay, maybe they won't. Now, here's another thing to potentially recast, reframe, see from a different angle, is often the way that the meta-crisis, poly-crisis collapse is discussed. Humans are the main characters. At best, someone might acknowledge the existence of the more than human world, just do some lip service to it. But those other organisms, it seems like we tend to still perceive them as extras in the film, or as victims, or as, purely utilitarian deliverers of environmental services. And humans have to be the heroes, supposedly. I think because we look around and we're like, well, I don't see any other species holding conferences about what they're going to do about this. Like, we're the only ones who are proactive problem solvers or whatever. And if we weren't to do something about it, what, you actually think that some other species would step up, And I think that it's also because there's this idea that, like, if you mess something up, then it's your responsibility to fix it, which is true, except in the case where, like, what if your toddler somehow commandeered your car and drove it into a tree and totaled it? In that case, would you say you destroyed it, now it's your job to fix it? Of course not, because the reason that the toddler drove the car into the tree in the first place is because they are incompetent as drivers. And that same incompetence is the reason why you would not entrust the fixing to them. And so when we say that we're the ones who mess things up and it's our job to fix it, what we're misunderstanding is that, like, the reason that we messed everything up is because we're incompetent. And so then collectively, no species could potentially run an entire planet. It's just that we were silly enough to try. And so now when we're thinking that we could rein all of our activity in and make things right at such a large scale, and to think that we know how and that we could do so in a way that goes fairly smoothly, we're continuing to fail to understand our own modest level of competence at best. And then thinking about that population graph and the way that that blue bar has been a constant along the bottom for tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years, and it's just the orange bar and the pink bar that are the anomalies. I thought, well, maybe from the perspective, if you want to talk zombie movies, which we keep bringing up whenever we talk about collapse, who is the zombie? From the perspective of the humans who were living in a sustainable way, who had a sustainable metabolism, and all the other species who had sustainable metabolisms. Civilizations are the ones who came along like some kind of mutant race or an onslaught of zombies that have been destroying the planet. So they're the weird anomaly that doesn't belong and is wreaking havoc. And also, that simultaneously doesn't mean that they're evil, because they didn't choose the zombie life chose them. And most of us are participating in this machine because there really isn't any other alternative available to us. And so the better question to be asking, rather than like, are we evil, is how do you live well knowing that your survival method has an expiration date? And then another weird jogging thought that I had was, although it is unfortunate if it turns out that we destabilize the climate so much that it makes large-scale agriculture impossible, which would also mean that probably a lot of other innocent species would be driven extinct. It seems that civilizations refuse to quit otherwise. They rise and fall again and again, and just after destroying one region, move on to another one. There's always, even no matter how many other societies and groups of humans and tribes and whatever figure out how to maintain a reasonably low metabolism, it seems that over the past 12,000 years, there have always been at least one, usually many at the same time, that come along and are determined to live with a higher metabolism that ends up ruining things for everybody else. And so maybe the way to put a positive spin on climate change, if you felt like you wanted to, is that this is the only way that's ever going to nip that in the bud and stop that from ever happening again. And maybe at this point now, Earth is going to be able to settle into some new phase that also is only temporary, but can at least last a little bit longer without some species that is too clever and repeatedly has offshoots that fail to resist the temptation to ramp up their metabolism and exert a higher level of control. And of course, that could be an oversimplification. Maybe there is a way of life and a viable path forward for humans who are part blue, part orange, probably not part pink. If you're a pink human, you're dependent on fossil fuels. That ain't lasting. And that's all I've got for you with this series. I hope it didn't feel like a complete waste of time.